Okay, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining me this morning. I'm so excited to have you here. So I just mentioned that I am sharing my screen. You should see live webinar, how to set strong workplace boundaries on your screens. Hopefully everybody can see that. If you're having technical difficulties or anything like that, or if you want to ask a question at any point during the webinar, you can use the chat function and I'll be checking in on that periodically just to make sure that we have an open flow of dialogue. That's really how I like to kind of run these things. I like them to be as interactive as possible. So I will be stopping at various points during my talking to check in to see if you guys have anything to share or say, or if there's any questions I can answer. And the chat functionality is the best way to do that. So once again, welcome. Really happy that you were able to sign in and join me this morning. I'm really excited to talk to you about this particular subject matter. It's something that I'm super passionate about. Oh, I think I already have a Q&A. One second. So as I was saying, my name is Chelsea, and I am a workplace culture consultant here in Toronto. I started my company about 3 years ago, and we specialize in human-centric design strategies for workplaces. So what that essentially means is we design culture and employee experiences with employees at the center, because it is our belief that when you optimize a workplace for potential and performance, that's really what it takes, is to put the employee, the workforce at the center of your design. And this has led us into a ton of really interesting disciplines across the board. We do employee value propositions. We talk about inclusion and diversity. We talk about employee engagement and experience. And one of the things that I've become really, really passionate about is the broader subject of psychological safety in the workplace. And more specifically, what we're going to be talking about today is something that I think is kind of picking up steam, but it doesn't often get the airtime that it really deserves, which is talking about boundaries in the workplace. Our boundaries with each other, our boundaries with ourselves, our boundaries with our companies. So I wanted to bring you a little bit of insight around that today. And we're going to spend the next hour or so just going through some of the basics and the fundamentals of workplace boundaries. And as you can see, these are the contents. It was pretty clear, I think, in the text of the webinar description, what we're going to be going through, but I'll just kind of take us through some of the key topics we're going to be covering. So we're going to talk fundamentals, what do we mean when we say boundaries in the workplace? What does that actually look like? We're going to talk about unlearning some key lessons about your self-worth and your value at work, because that really is a huge hindrance for a lot of people when it comes to setting clear guidelines and parameters, aka boundaries for themselves at work, is finding that clear path to seeing their value and their worth and understanding, what are my rights and what am I able to really lay down in terms of firm lines around what I need, what I don't need, what I accept, what I won't accept. We're going to delve a little bit more into communication boundaries, because I think this is so important, especially in our day and age, to talk about communication at work. I think, with the culture of immediacy, which I'm going to delve into a little bit more, the lines have gotten blurred. And, for me specifically, I have struggled a lot in my work in corporate environments, also with my work as an entrepreneur, to really set and maintain those clear boundaries and parameters around flow of communication and what feels best and most healthy for me. We're going to be talking a little bit about reinforcing boundaries and kind of what that looks like. And then we're going to clue up with some boundary practice, or essentially different ways to say no, thank you. And that's a little bit of a reductive description, saying no, because boundary setting and maintenance is about so much more than that. But you're going to see in a little bit that we're going to do kind of a practical component at the end around what healthy boundaries look like. And I just want to mention, I am recording this webinar just because I'll probably share it on social media for my my YouTube and potentially my my LinkedIn and Instagram channels. So just want to let you know that right up front. Okie dokie. So I always like to start off with a little bit of intention setting. Why are we talking about this today? Why did I put this out there and select this as a really important piece of subject matter that I want to talk about and I want to disseminate some knowledge on? And I think it's because, for me at least, there's a little bit of a cultural moment happening around positive psychology and how we're all being a little bit more vulnerable with each other, especially on social media. And this is really happening, I think, more so in the personal sphere, but I really think it bears discussion, how this bleeds into our professional environments. We can't ever say that, it's a completely separate, disparate two worlds there with our personal and our professional. The things that we experience socially and culturally outside of the workplace ultimately end up coming into the workplace with us. And, as I was preparing this content, I was watching some YouTube videos and doing some research, and I realized that the YouTube algorithm was serving me up the perfect intentionality for this webinar. I keep getting ads for AI tools to manage my schedule as an entrepreneur. So every, 30 seconds in a YouTube video that I'm watching, I get these other entrepreneurs who are saying, my schedule used to be so hectic and I had clients calling me all the time and I was triple booked for meetings until I got this AI tool. And now my schedule is amazing. Look at it. And that's great. Not knocking the AI tools. I'm sure they do a fantastic job. But I couldn't help but think to myself, well, you can have the most beautiful, well-arranged schedule that you want, like all color-coded and everything. But if you don't have strong boundaries to maintain that schedule and set your guidelines and set your parameters, it doesn't matter. You're still going to be super stressed out. So with the advances that we have in technology, I think it has been a bit of a double-edged sword. I think we do have more opportunities to kind of curate our experiences for sure in the professional realm, but you also need to have that capability and be tapped into kind of what those values are for yourself so you can reinforce your boundaries and maintain them. So, when it comes to our workplaces, there's just a different set of expectations a lot of times. And I think that that bears discussion. A lot of times, when we join a particular workplace, you're asked to kind of like tolerate and accept behavior that you probably wouldn't be asked to tolerate in any other sphere of your life. And that's why setting boundaries are so important. It's also important to remember that when you join a workplace, you're joining a culture. And it's not your job to change the culture or change anybody else. You don't have to be best friends with everybody. But you do have to be respectful and cordial and find some way to relate positively to your environment. And that's why I think we're seeing a lot of or a lot of kind of workplace sociologists and philosophers and people who kind of, create thought leadership around workplace culture are kind of eschewing this notion of the family culture, like we're a family here. I'm sure that's not entirely untrue, but it kind of got to a place where it was overused, saying our workplace is just like a family. And it's just not. I mean, you can't fire a family member for underperforming. Your workplace isn't a family. That's why when it comes to your personal sphere, your family, your friends, and your professional sphere, we need to talk about how we interact, how we build our relationships and maintain our relationships, and what our place and our identity looks like within that context. So that's why boundaries are so, so important to talk about. And I just don't think they get talked about enough. So I want to lead off just, I guess, in the spirit of vulnerability and kind of giving you a little bit of insight as to why I'm so passionate about this. I wanted to take just a couple minutes up front here to talk about my personal story and my personal history with boundaries. So, around 2017, I was working in the finance industry, And I started having panic attacks every single morning when I would come into work. So for me, the panic attack looked, really kind of intense. I would do my best to hide it. I would run to the bathroom. I would kind of throw up. I would hyperventilate. And this was happening so consistently, and I was losing sleep, all because I had this crazy, irrational fear running through me all the time that I was going to get fired. Even though I was performing, even though there was no logical explanation for this, there was nothing that was going on that would have indicated that I was even anywhere close to that. I still woke up every morning, today's the day. Today's the day I'm going to get fired. So I thought this was imposter syndrome. I had read a little bit about it. It was kind of buzzwordy at the time. So I decided to seek out some therapy, and that began my lifelong journey with therapy. It's still going on today, but it was super helpful because I was able to kind of peel back the layers of that reaction and understand that, yeah, there was a little bit of that impostery thing going on. But really, what that was a smokescreen for a much more deep rooted underlying lack of self worth and self confidence that came to me through some pretty significant traumas that I experienced in my childhood that I was carrying into the workplace. And I was actually diagnosed with PTSD, and what these panic attacks amounted to were flashbacks and, things that were triggering me unknowingly. And I was able to course correct, to rectify that, to go through cognitive behavioral therapy exercises that really, really helped me. But if anyone who has had mental health issues or experienced that, has been to therapy, has had to deal with this, anyone who has gone through that understands this is a lifelong journey. It's not something that gets healed. So having some modicum of control over your surroundings and your environment, that's very, very important. And it was very, very important for me to be in a place, a workplace, where I was able to exercise my boundaries and to have that kind of open dialogue and open communication while still being successful at work. That was kind of never the question. Just, being able to create kind of a working environment, and a set of guidelines that enabled me to show up and do my best work without triggering anything. So a few years later, I was interviewing and I ended up going to work at a different company, a much smaller company. And I chose it because through the interview process, they really like reinforced and talked about their commitment to well-being and their workplace culture that really celebrated everybody's ability to kind of flex and to have an opinion about how they work best and to have that voice respected. So I was like, this is perfect. This is amazing for me. Unfortunately, once I got into the role, it only took about 3 months. Things started to unravel quite quickly. There were a lot of issues around, you were kind of expected to work like a 16 or 17-hour day at this company. There wasn't a lot of support for, just kind of putting your hand up and being able to say, when you needed support or when you didn't need support. There were some issues where, we were a consultancy, so we would do exercises to kind of test on ourselves what we were selling to clients. There was this one exercise that we did where we all gathered in a team meeting, and the leaders asked us to be very vulnerable and share moments in our lives when we felt like we either belonged or we didn't belong. And people got really into it, and shared, and there were tears shed. And then when it got to the point where it was the leaders' turn to share, they refused and they said, no, we're not going to share. And then that coupled kind of with the time boundaries. And then finally, I was asked, at the end of the summer, it was over the summer, I had put in time for, to go and visit my parents. It was at the end of COVID and I hadn't seen them for 2 years. And because of my workload, I was told I would need to cancel that vacation. So I know this isn't, out of like so off the wall or out of the ordinary of an experience. A lot of people work in these very high pressure environments. But for me, I found myself back in that place, having those panic attacks morning after morning, consistently worried every time that I opened my computer that today is the day that I'm going to be let go. All of these like catastrophizing ideals happening in my head. And I just decided it wasn't the workplace for me. I couldn't do it. And I ended up quitting and starting this company. And that was about, 3.5 years ago. And I just kind of decided that I wanted to try to create my own workplace reality and set my own boundaries on a permanent basis because it was just such a negative experience for me. So that's really kind of my story around why psychological safety and why an openness to boundary setting and being with an organization that enables me to set my boundaries and set the parameters around how I feel most successful. That's why it's so important. And I think if you work at a company that has, a few people, you need to be aware of that. And there's a certain level of empathizing I think that we need to do when we're embarking on these kind of discourse and dialogues, because everybody comes from a different lived experience and everybody feels successful in a bit of a different way. So there's a lot of getting curious, I think, that you need to do. And it's just really important to consider personal histories and personal stories and try to bring that in as much as we can to our own boundary setting practice. Okay. So we are going to talk a little bit right now about the fundamentals of workplace boundaries. So this is kind of just starting from ground zero, assuming that we don't have any real understanding of what a workplace boundary is, even though I'm sure most people here today actually do. But I just want to level set for everybody what is a boundary. So when we talk about on the personal side, boundaries they're the rules that we set for each other within our relationships, and they really are kind of a determining factor in successful relationships. If you can be a boundaried person and be engaging with a boundaried person, it lends itself to, much healthier kind of dialogue and interaction. So a person with healthy boundaries, they can say no to others when they want to, but they're also comfortable opening themselves up to close relationships. And in fact, you find when you have stronger boundaries, your relationships actually get better and closer. And it's a little bit counterintuitive to what a lot of people think. A lot of people think, oh my goodness, if I say no to this person or if I turn down this request, that's going to damage the relationship. But if we're setting healthy boundaries and we're doing it in the right way, it actually teaches people, how to behave with us and how to interact with us, and vice versa. If we can respect other people's boundaries, the same happens in the opposite direction, and our relationships just get better and stronger. So when we talk about personal boundaries in the workplace, we're talking about the parameters that we create for the relationships we have within the organization we work for. So, with that company, with our colleagues, with our leaders, our clients, our customers, and most importantly, ourselves. So, when we start to think about what are my workplace boundaries, they span across a bunch of different verticals that we're going to talk about in a second. But you can start to kind of determine what your boundaries are in the workplace by asking yourself, what are my core values for my professional life? What are the things that are non-negotiable, so to speak? And that kind of becomes the platform where you start to build your approach to boundaries. So, as mentioned, we can probably think just off the top of our heads, there are a few like clear kinds of boundaries that we set for ourselves in the workplace, but there are there are other kinds that may not be so clear or may be a little bit more multifaceted. So first off, there are the boundaries that we have with ourselves. Those are super important and often overlooked. Self boundaries, the ones where you say to yourself, this is who I am, this is what I do, this is what I can't do, this is what I don't do. And then the boundaries that we have with other people, which is, an externalization of that, where you say, if you're being pushed in any way or asked to do something, or, there's a certain activity or kind of something that is coming towards you from another person that you need to have change. That is when you set a boundary with another person and say, look, this is who I am, this is what I value, this is what I will do, this is what I won't do. There are all different kinds of ways to set boundaries, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, but primarily you have your self boundaries and you have your boundaries with others. So some examples more specifically of different types of workplace boundaries, they could look like time boundaries. So that's kind of around your availability and your schedule, and when you are going to be taking calls, when you're not going to be taking calls, and a multitude of other things. Communication boundaries, which we're going to talk about a little bit more, as I mentioned. We're going to delve into that, but that is how you interact with others and how you feel most successful interacting and maintaining relationships with others. Physical boundaries, of course, that's anything to do with our physical person and ourself. Intellectual boundaries are really interesting. It's kind of around our ideas, our opinions, our voice, how we respect and value our own opinions, how we respect and value the opinions of others while still having a boundaried approach. And there's a ton more. So if anyone has any, boundaries that they know of or they've set, I invite you to share them at any point in the chat. And, it would be great to talk about some of those. So, this is by no means an exhaustive list, but this is kind of a start when we start to think about the different boundaries that we have in the workplace. So I just want to mention that this is something that takes a lot of practice, right? It takes a lot of courage to kind of show up as your boundaried self at work. Oh, I have another question. So back to the content. It does take a lot of courage to show up as your boundaried self. This is something that takes a lot of practice. And I just want to kind of put it out there that a boundary is about your actions. It's not about changing another person's actions. That's kind of the difference between a boundary and an ultimatum. An ultimatum is more so kind of making somebody do something, or there will be consequences kind of thing. A boundary is just saying, this is what I'm willing to do, this is what I'm not willing to do. So if you're setting a boundary and it's starting to sound like I need you to change your behavior, you need a little more practice on setting boundaries. But a lot of times we hear from people, I don't know how to set boundaries, or I don't have any boundaries. I'm not a person who has them. You absolutely do have boundaries, especially in the workplace. I mean, if you close a meeting room door when you're about to have a conversation with somebody, or you're about to take a call, if you set your team status to offline or busy when you're in a meeting, if you have a special place where you eat lunch because you want to be be away from people for a little while and have that time for yourself, those are all boundaries. So we all walk through the world and walk through our professional environment with boundaries. It just takes a little bit more practice and refinement if we want to kind of show up with that very intentional boundaried approach. And we'll talk about a little later when boundaries need to be set. But if you're feeling any kind of a level of discomfort in the workplace, or if something needs to change, or if you just don't feel like you have as much control as you want to, it may be time to discuss setting some boundaries. So let's talk about the proficiency levels of setting boundaries. So we are all somewhere within this spectrum of being boundaried individuals. We have our rigid boundaries, porous boundaries, and healthy boundaries. So ideally, we will all be here, right? We will have healthy boundaries across the board, but most people, including myself, are not like that. Sometimes we tend a little bit more toward the rigid. Sometimes we tend a little more toward the porous, but let's just talk about what those look like. So a person with rigid boundaries, they're not likely to ever communicate or ask for help. They don't have a lot of close, trusting relationships, which is, on its face, not a bad thing if you are a person who chooses to show up at work and not really get too involved or not form those close bonds. That's okay. But you would like to have some colleagues at work that you trust. And, it's kind of part of a healthy working ethos to have good relationships. Rigid boundaried people are very protective, almost secretive about their personal information and space. So if you can picture a force field, they have a very strong and close one around them. And they can often seem detached or disengaged because they're super preoccupied with maintaining those rigid boundaries. People with porous boundaries, on the other hand, they can often overshare or go into too much detail. I've been guilty of this. I know a lot of people have been guilty of this. They have a lot of difficulty saying no to requests. So there's kind of that people pleasing element. They get over involved with other issues or problems. In the workplace, this can show up like kind of inserting yourself into situations where it's not really necessary or taking on more than anyone has really asked you to, and ultimately fearing rejection if you say no or if you enforce a boundary, that kind of fear. So if you remember my story from earlier, that was very much me at that point in my career. I was constantly afraid that I just could not say no to anything, or there would be horrific consequences for my life. If you have healthy boundaries, you value your own opinion, you don't compromise on your values, you share personal information in an appropriate way, and you're accepting when someone says no to you. So that's a really important point. So none of this means that you're rude or disrespectful. You're able to do this in a healthy, respectful way. And you're also able to recognize and support when somebody is setting a boundary with you. People who have healthy boundaries and who are accustomed to setting and enforcing those, they have an easier time when someone sets a boundary with them. And that defensiveness that kind of comes with, if you're a person with porous boundaries, for instance, and you ask somebody to do something for you, take on a request, and the answer is, no, I don't work at the past 6, or no, I have that day booked off, I can't do it. Oftentimes there's a little bit of defensiveness that sets in with you as the porous boundary person, like, well, what the heck? Like, how dare they say no to me? I do this for people all the time. So when you have that healthy boundaried approach, you're able to not only respect yourself and your boundaries, but other people's boundaries as well. Okay, we're all good. Sorry, guys. Perfect. Oh, okay. So this is, sorry, I was just checking and I saw there was a couple more Q&As, but it was just letting me know that the chat was good. So we're good. So this is an example that I wanted to give of the different types of boundaries, and see if you can kind of recognize your own personal style within these. So this is a request that has come down from a manager potentially at around 4 p.m. in the day. So we have, hi, sorry for the last minute request, but I need you to join the meeting today at 6 p.m. with the team in BC. Can you prepare a brief rundown for everyone, of everything that you have been working on? So picture this being an email or a Teams message or an IM that you get at 4 o'clock in the day. So someone with rigid boundaries might respond, I'm unable to attend, or they may not respond at all. Someone with porous boundaries, their response might sound something like, I think I mentioned that I have a family engagement at 5 p.m. today. It's my grandfather's 90th birthday. I would love to attend, absolutely, but I have to pick up the cake and I think it's too short notice to make alternative plans. I'm so sorry. Maybe I could attend for the first 30 minutes if that helps. So we see the over explanation, the apologizing, and then kind of the bending on the boundary. A healthy boundaried person, I want to support as best I can. However, I have a prior engagement I need to attend at that time. I'll be happy to provide my availability for a meeting tomorrow, and I can deliver a high level summary of my projects by 5 p.m. So we'll talk a little bit more about this in a few minutes, but it's saying I want to support you. I cannot do it right now for an important reason. And here is what I am able to do instead. So it's not compromising on your values. You're being respectful, but you're reinforcing your boundary. So wherever you fall kind of in that spectrum, we all, tend towards one side or the other at different times and for different issues. But it's just interesting to look at kind of the differentiation and the dichotomy between these. Okay, let's talk a little bit about your value at work and some of the key lessons that we need to unlearn, because that's a huge detractor for how people feel either abled or disenabled to set their boundaries in a strong, confident way. And I just want to talk a little bit about, the concept of privilege and how this all works within that. So I understand, like, depending on your situation and your workplace, setting boundaries can be either more difficult or a lot easier, and that's a question of privilege. So I want to say that I acknowledge in my story when I was able to leave that workplace because my boundaries were constantly being disrespected. That was my privilege. I was able to do that because I was in a privileged position. Not everybody is in that situation. And some workplaces or bosses make it easier or more difficult to set your boundaries. And there's also the question of the type of work you do too, right? You can't say in certain jobs, you just don't have the option to say, I don't work past 6 or I can't pick up this shift. So that is something that I want to acknowledge. There's no kind of one size fits all approach to boundaries. Boundaries are about your values, respecting yourself, and no matter what your working situation is, you absolutely deserve to be able to set and maintain boundaries in the workplace. So we're just going to talk about a little bit about that and how you can be confident about setting and reinforcing boundaries no matter what your working situation looks like. So just to call out that fear influences a lot of our decisions around boundaries. So that question that popped into my head a lot back in the day, and probably pops into a lot of people's heads. What if I set this boundary? What if I say no to this and I get fired? Or what if there are consequences for me? And I just want to call out that there have been a lot of unhealthy and false notions embedded within us, especially here in North America over the past 100 years, about what it means to be a good employee and a good worker. And a lot of that involves subjugating our own sense of self and our own boundaries. And I feel like we're coming out of that time right now. We're entering a time where we're not expected to do that, or we shouldn't be expected to do that anymore. So I want to call out that you're not less of an employee, less of a performer, less of a contributor because you have boundaries at work. And one of the things that we can do to kind of overcome that fear is to think about the concept of cognitive bias. So this is one example of cognitive bias that oftentimes prevents us from setting strong boundaries. And there's one particular cognitive bias that I feel like we all have in some measure, is called personalization. And that's the tendency to blame yourself for things that are beyond your control. So say, for example, you went on vacation, a planned scheduled vacation that was approved. And while you were on vacation, something went wrong with one of your projects, and there's a planned launch and you weren't able to launch on time, and you were an influencer, or you were playing a key role within that project, and you sit there on the beach or at your family's cabin or wherever you're vacationing, and you just beat yourself up and you say, why the hell did I go on vacation? Or why didn't I make a better contingency plan? I should have gotten my stuff done faster. I should have been better. And this is a really, intense, profound kind of hindrance on our ability to set boundaries in the future, because oftentimes you're just not that powerful and you're not that influential. And even if you were in the office, things would have gone wrong. So, challenging those kind of cognitive biases whenever we can. And that's a core part of cognitive behavioral therapy as well, is relooking at what assumptions that we're making and how it's holding us back from having those healthy parameters and healthy boundaries. And the other part of this too is knowing your rights. Knowledge is power. And the more that you can inform yourself, and I'm talking specific to Canada and even more specifically to Ontario here, because that's where I'm located. That's where I do most of my consulting. But this is a global thing. Most countries, provinces, states, whatever, have policies and programs around the rights of the worker. And the more that you can educate and inform yourself about what you are actually entitled to, the more you can kind of dispel a lot of this fear and take an educated approach to setting your workplace boundaries. So the big one, and I've talked a lot about this, I've written about it pretty extensively, is the right to disconnect. So this started in 2023, I believe, in Ontario. Lots of European countries have implemented it already. I think it's Canada wide at this point. But basically, any company with 25 or more employees must have a written policy on disconnecting from the workplace. So, in the Employment Standards Act, that means engaging in work related communications, emails, telephone calls, video calls, sending or reviewing messages, and just being free from the performance of work. So if you do work for a company that has 25 or more people, you should really look into that, because they should have a policy on what it means to disconnect from work. And if you're talking about your time or your communication boundaries being violated, it's worthwhile to go back to that kind of language and positioning, and you can kind of build boundaries around that and have that as a support structure for enforcing your boundaries. There's also the Canadian Human Rights Act, which is extremely robust and multifaceted, and it talks about prohibiting discrimination in employment and services within federal jurisdiction. So that's Canada wide. So you have the duty to accommodate, you have the Employment Equity Act, you have the Federal Contractors Program, you have the legislated employment equity program, you have the Workplace Equity Information Management System. So I provide a lot of one-on-one advice and coaching to, employees and workers from all different sectors and all different experience levels. And one of the things that I see typically with younger workers, people in their 20s just getting started in their career, and I dealt with this just a few weeks ago. It was somebody who was feeling that, they just were not having their boundaries or their voice respected in the workplace. They were being asked to do more than they were comfortable with, to take on things that they weren't prepared for. And when they tried to push back in a healthy way, that was being challenged. And some of the things that were being said and the interactions that were happening were way offside. It wasn't okay. So that's kind of always, one of my first lines of defense is to know your rights, to understand who you are and what your value is in the workplace, and understand that there are policies and programs and language that has been developed specifically to protect you. The other thing to talk about is the Canada Labor Code. So if you haven't really familiarized yourself with this, a lot of us know that these exist, but understanding the ins and outs of them is just such a powerful tool. You can talk about employment standards, holidays, sick days, vacations, working hours, unfair terminations, minimum wage, layoff procedures, workplace health and safety. All of that is covered. We have support systems for the Canadian worker. And if you are in a position like I was talking about earlier, where, maybe you don't feel as empowered in your role and in your company to just set your boundaries because it's the right thing to do to respect someone's boundaries. And you have a leadership that listens, and people around you who are willing to take your boundaries on board. It can be helpful to familiarize yourself with these different standards and acts and policies just to know what your rights are. So, really quick, let's talk about how do we know what boundaries to set. So, this can be challenging. What hill should I die on, kind of, so to speak? Like, what things should I really put my foot down on? What's important to me? So, one of the things that I always like to uh, counsel, I guess, or promote is listening to your body. So, we actually have a physiological response to things that are good for us and things that aren't good for us. So, if you're losing sleep before work, if you're feeling a little bit sick to your stomach before certain meetings, if you're experiencing kind of a chest tightness, that means that your nervous system is telling you something. You're having a reaction to a certain person, a set of circumstances, maybe your role as a whole, and you need to revisit how you're showing up and how you're setting those clear parameters that protect you. And oftentimes what happens in those instances where you're experiencing internal anxiety or a nervous response, when you finally have the conversation and you're able to set that communication boundary or time boundary or whatever, those symptoms dissipate and go away. And that was my story. So I like to I'm a big fan of mantras, and this is one that I kind of developed as a response to that ideal worker stereotype, where there's all these misconceptions about what it means to be a good worker, what it means to be loyal. People say, if you don't log on, or if you don't deliver this, or if you don't do things this way, you're not a loyal or good employee. So I like to say my response is, I'm loyal to doing great work. I am loyal to treating people with respect. I am not loyal to feeling taken advantage of or having my voice suppressed just because someone is issuing me a paycheck. And this goes to the concept of knowing your worth and understanding what your rights are, and the fact that we all deserve to be able to set and maintain boundaries in the workplace that keep us safe and keep us protected. Going to delve into the communication boundary conversation here, because I just think it's so, so important. We live in this culture of immediacy now, and there's this idea that just because you want to be in touch with somebody, you deserve to be in touch with them. And I think that, maybe back 20 or 30 years ago, email was, kind of taking off. Maybe it's 40 years ago now, geez, but you would get an email and you would wait for the response. And now you might get an email and then you'll get an IM and then you'll get a Teams message and then they might call you on your phone. And it's just gotten a little out of hand. So with technological advancements to our communication toolkit, there's this misconception that because I want to talk to you, I have the right to talk to you, or because I want a response from you, I deserve that response right now. And this is where boundaries are so, so important, both giving and receiving, setting and respecting. If just because someone is asking you for something and following up and following up and following up, that doesn't mean that you have to align with their method or their way of communicating. Conversely, just because you are continually following up with someone doesn't mean that they are obliged to snap into action and jump to and give you exactly what you want. So when we're talking about communication boundaries, we're talking about the exchange of information between individuals. And healthy communication involves respecting and understanding other people's perspectives and boundaries, and it just facilitates a healthier overall relationship and a mutual respect. So that is what we want at work. We want relationships with our coworkers and our leaders in our organization that are built on trust and empathy and understanding. And communication, in my view, is kind of the biggest facet to this. So when we're talking about questions to ask yourself to start getting into that notion of, how do I set my own communication boundaries? You have to ask yourself, what forms of communication am I okay with at work, not okay with? So, this for me at that company I was talking about before, there was this expectation that we had to be on a personal group text where it was just fun stuff that we shared with each other. There was a LinkedIn group message with all of the team that you were expected to be on. There was Teams messages and emails and, phone calls late at night. And the expectation was you were just available for all of this communication. And I would say, I prefer to communicate over professional channels when we're talking about work related matters or when I'm engaging with my colleagues. And I would say, I can't get back to this right now. I will do it tomorrow. And people would continue to follow up, follow up, follow up. And then I would hear, oh, she's ignoring me. She's ghosting me. And it's like, no, I'm not. I was very clear with you, but that goes back to the expectation of constant contact with people. And if you're clear with people and you state your boundary clearly and then they continue to follow up, and we'll talk about this in a second, it's about reinforcing the boundary. That really is on them. So other conversations you might want to have or questions you might want to ask yourself, what is my window of availability when it comes to unscheduled meetings and discussions? Am I okay with being contacted after hours? Some people are okay with that, other people aren't. You have to decide for yourself what your communication boundaries are. And I like, this is very much related to what I was just talking about when it comes to that whole inundation aspect. So a couple years ago, the WHO added burnout to the International Classification of Diseases. And we all should be familiar with the concept of burnout at this point. It's a form of exhaustion and mental fatigue. And a lot of it happens when we don't feel capable of setting and maintaining boundaries in the workplace for ourselves. So feeling constantly barraged or inundated all the time, feeling pressure to respond to every single message, feeling unheard or ignored when you speak up, and having a really negative reaction to that. All of these things fast track to burnout. But also, all of these things are remedied by having a strong boundaried approach to communications. And then this is on the next slide, but probably harder than setting the boundary in the first place is reinforcing the boundary. Because I know for me, it was just so frustrating when I would say things once and I would expect people to kind of just understand, like, this is her boundary. We have to respect that. People are not wired that way. If things have been kind of going one way for a long time, people are going to need reminders and need you to reinforce it. And they may get frustrated with you. But the key thing to remember is that's not your responsibility. People can have the reaction that they're going to have as long as you are respectfully maintaining your boundary. That's all you can do. So, the three critical aspects to setting and maintaining boundaries are defining your values, asserting your boundaries. That's step one. That's really hard. And then honoring and defending your boundaries, which is even harder. So when people push you, when people say, you're ignoring me, you're ghosting me, where's this thing? I asked you this, text, 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 and then anything outside of the realm of that, whatever kind of boundaries you've decided to set for yourself, you need to prepare that they're going to be challenged, and you need to prepare to just almost gray rock, which is a term that describes kind of giving the least amount of emotional response while being extremely respectful and just saying, no, I'm sorry, I cannot do this, or I will get back to you tomorrow, or simply responding when you're ready to respond. So now this is the last section. We have about 4 or 5 minutes, and I want to talk a little bit about boundary practice. So this is maybe when we can use the chat to chime in for you to give me any of your ideas around these, because I have some just like A/B scenarios. So when do you need to set boundaries? Well, this is by no means an exhaustive list, but ideally, well before you're concerned about burnout, you would have boundaries in place. If you're getting to the burnout stage, you're kind of, you need boundaries more than anyone, but you're already kind of a little bit far down that road to be just starting to set boundaries, because setting boundaries is tough in and of itself. So you want to be mentally strong when you're starting to set your boundaries. When you're feeling uncomfortable with any aspect of your work life, when you're feeling pressured to do more than you're able to do, when you feel you are witnessing harm being done, that's a big one. Or if harm is being done to you, like bias or harassment or anything like that, that's a key time when you need to revisit your core values and come up with those strong boundary statements. And then finally, just when you need something to change. So these are 5 ways to say no, thank you. And that's kind of my simplified way of saying, here are 5 ways to set a boundary. And we're going to practice these. So you can describe your boundary action. You can provide a brief rationale for it. I won't do this because. You can give an alternative. I can't do this, but here's what I can do. You can be clear about your motivation, just saying, I don't want to do this, or you can let your actions speak for you. So just in the last 2 or 3 minutes, I have 5 of these examples, and I want you to tell me A or B. You can just think of this for yourself. You can use the chat, or you can just think, which one would this be? Just let me know which is the stronger boundary statement. So neither of these are wrong, but one of them is the stronger boundary. So let's just try. A project manager continually sends you multiple, oh, sorry. Oh, B. Yes, sorry, someone got ahead of me already. A project manager continually sends you multiple emails after your defined working hours and follows up first thing the next morning, asking why you didn't respond. So A, stop sending me emails, or B, I will not be responding to emails. And it is indeed B, because that's the action that's about you, and the other one is asking the other person to change their action. This one is a physical boundary. So you have a coworker that stands very close to you when they're visiting your desk, and sometimes places a hand on your upper back or on your forearm when they're talking to you, and you're uncomfortable with this. So would it be A, if you continue to touch me, I'll have to put more space between us, or B, please don't do that, I don't like it. And I'll just wait. Oh, we have a couple answers. A and A, yes, exactly. Not to say that B is a bad thing to say. It's just A is more about you and what you will do if the behavior continues. So this one is, you are on a planned vacation for 2 weeks and a colleague continuously texts you, asking you to confirm things like when you'll be back in the office. A or B, don't text me on vacation. I won't be answering any work-related questions on my scheduled vacation. And I have a feeling, yep, it's B. Don't text me on vacation. I mean, that's fine to say, but if you want to set a strong boundary, again, it's about you. Now, this one might be a little bit more difficult. So your coworker stops by your workstation to vent all the time about her boyfriend and her mother and personal situations, and you want it to stop. So you can say, I don't want to engage in these type of personal conversations at work, or you can say, it makes me feel uncomfortable when you share those personal details. So in this case, it would be A. The answer would be A. Exactly. And then I think we have one more. A colleague on another team often sends you multiple documents to review and follows up within an hour asking, have you seen what I sent you? So A, responding when you're ready to share the information, or B, I need you to give me more time. And I'll just let you know, because we're at time right now, it is A. A is the stronger boundary, just because this one is, again, asking them to change their behavior. It's not that you can't say this, but sometimes letting your actions speak for themselves when you're setting a boundary is the preferable way to do it. Okay. So this is just a reminder that they're for you, they're not for anyone else. Workplace boundaries can take a long time to set and even longer to learn how to maintain. And it's really important to be patient with yourself. So I kind of rushed through that last slide or so because I know we're at time. I really want to thank everybody for your attention this morning. This was a really great experience. And this is like a very short, truncated version of this type of a learning. I do deliver learnings for individuals and teams that are more kind of workshop based, that are more in depth. So if you liked this type of content and you're interested in exploring more, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. This is my email, or you can connect with me on LinkedIn. And once again, really, really, really thank you for signing up and for joining me this morning. It was really fun to facilitate this for you, and I hope that you took something away from it.